Hello, this is the luckiest maths teacher in the world. Thank you so much for tuning into this video in which we will go through operations with decimals. So we're going to look at adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing decimals. So we'll start with adding and subtracting decimals. Turns out this is quite a bit easier than multiplying and dividing. So to add or subtract decimals, you just place in columns and you just add or subtract the way you've been adding or subtracting large numbers in primary school. So let's say I want to add 0.96 and 1.208. So I'm just going to arrange these in columns and add them exactly like we've been doing. So they need to have the same number of digits. So see, 0.96 doesn't have as many digits, so I'm just going to put a 0 there. You know that 0.96 and 0.960 are the same numbers. So now we're going to add in columns starting from the right. So 0 plus 8, of course, gives us 8. 6 plus 0 gives us 6. 9 plus 2 is 11, so we put a 1 here and we carry a 1. Now, when you're adding or subtracting decimals in columns, you must make sure that the decimal point goes under the decimal points, all in a line like that. So now we have 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. So 0.96 plus 1.28 is 2.168. How easy is that? Let's look at a subtraction. So let's do 2.375 minus 1.94. So again, I'm going to arrange these in columns. Because the second one doesn't have as many digits after the decimal point, I'm going to put a 0 there. And now we're going to do everything in columns just like you're used to. So we go 5 minus 0 is 5, easy as. 7 minus 4 is equal to 3. Now then we run into a problem, 3 minus 9, can't really do that, so we're going to borrow like you would when you're subtracting large numbers. So we make this into a 1 so that we can make the 3 into a 13. I can do 13 minus 9. 13 minus 9 is just 4. So now, instead of being 2 minus 1, it's 1 minus 1, which is 0. Once again, you must put decimal point under decimal point. The answer is 0.435. So that's all there is to adding or subtracting. Let's now look at multiplying decimals. So to multiply decimals, what you do is actually multiply the numbers as if there were no decimal points, and then you count how many decimal points should be in your answer. So that sounds a bit confusing, but hopefully it'll be clear after we go through some examples. So let's say I have 6 times 1.2. So what I'm going to do is do 6 times 12. For now, I'm going to ignore the decimal point. So 6 times 12 is 72. Now, in the product, there was 1 digit after the decimal point, just this 2 here. So what I need to do is I'm going to make my answer have just 1 number after the decimal point. So because there was a 2 after the decimal point, my answer is going to have 1 number after the decimal point. So I put a point here. So now there's 1 digit after the decimal point. 6 times 1.2 is equal to 7.2. So what about this here? 0.8 times 0.12. Well, again, I'm going to multiply 8 times 12. I'm going to multiply together the two numbers as if there were no decimal points. So I know that 8 times 12 is equal to 96. So in the product, there was 1, 2, 3 numbers after the decimal point. So my answer has to have 3 numbers after the decimal point. So I'm going to put a decimal point here. See, problem is there's only 2 numbers after the decimal point. So to make 3 numbers, I'm going to add in a 0. Now there are 1, 2, 3 numbers after the decimal point. So 0.8 times 0.12 is equal to 0.096. 1, 2, 3 numbers after the decimal point in the product. 1, 2, 3 numbers after the decimal point in my answer. All right, now we're just going to look at multiplying decimals by powers of 10. So we're just going to have a quick review of multiplying and dividing by powers of 10. This is needed to divide decimals. So powers of 10 are numbers like 10, 100,000, 10,000, 100,000, a million. They are just numbers with a 1 and then a few zeros. So we're looking at multiplying and dividing numbers by 10 or 100 or 1,000. So to do that, to multiply or divide by one of these numbers, you simply move the decimal point a number of places. The number of places you move the decimal point is equal to the number of zeros. So multiplying or dividing by 100, you move the decimal point twice because there are 2 zeros. If you multiplied or divided by 10,000, you'd move the decimal point 4 spots because there are 4 zeros. When you're multiplying by one of these powers of 10, you move the decimal point to the right. If you're dividing by one of these powers of 10, you move the decimal point to the left. Let's look at some examples. So let's say I want to do 3.041 times 1,000. So I have a decimal multiplied by a power of 10. Power of 10 has 3 zeros, so I move the decimal point 3 spots and I go to the right because I'm multiplying. So I move the decimal point 1, 2, 3 spots. I move it to here. The answer is 3041 or 3041. So let's say I have 29.2 divided by 10,000. So because there are 4 zeros in the power of 10, I need to move this decimal point 4 spots. Because I'm dividing, I need to move the decimal point left. I need to move this decimal point 4 spots left. 1, 2. Now, because if I move it here, I've run out of numbers, I insert zeros in here. So the answer I get, so I'd get moving the decimal point 4 spots to the left, 0.00292. So if I move the decimal point 2 spots here, I need to move it 2 more. So that's why after the 2, I've added in 2 zeros. So that's how you multiply, divide by powers of 10. That should be a revision. Let's now move on to dividing decimals. So dividing decimals is unfortunately quite tricky. Dividing a decimal by a whole number isn't so tricky because you can just use short division. So let's say I have something like 7.64 divided by 4. So I got a decimal divide a whole number. So short division. This is the same as saying how many times does 4 go in to 7.64? So then I go 4 goes into 7 once, remainder 3. So put a 1 there and the remainder goes here. So decimal point needs to be above decimal point here. So then how many times does 4 not go into 6, but how many times does 4 go into 36? The answer is 9, so I put a 9 there. There's no remainder here, so I don't carry anything over. How many times does 4 go into 4? Well, that's just 1. So the answer here is 1.91. That's easy enough, but what about when you have to divide a decimal by another decimal? So when you're dividing the decimal by another decimal, you need to write it as a fraction, one number divided by another fraction. And then you need to use what we learned on the previous slide. You'll be multiplying the numerator and denominator by a power of 10 so that the fraction only has whole numbers. So that probably makes absolutely no sense to you. Let's look at an example. Hopefully it'll become clearer. So let's say we have 0.42 divide 0.07, decimal divided by a decimal. So we're going to write this as a fraction. So 0.42 divide, because remember the fraction line means divide, 0.07. So that's the first part, what I meant by write as a fraction. Now what we're going to do is multiply numerator and denominator by a power of 10, so we only have whole numbers. What does that mean? Well, what I'm going to do, see this is 0.07. I want to move this decimal point 2 spots so the denominator is a whole number. Remember, to move the decimal point 2 spots to the right is the same as timesing by 100. So I'm going to times the denominator by 100 to make this into a whole number. But if I times the bottom by 100, I need to times the top by 100. So then I have, after multiplying by 100, 0.42 times 100 is 42. 0.07 times 100 is 7. Timesing by 100, I just move the decimal point 2 spots to the right. Move decimal point 2 spots to the right. Now, 42 divided by 7, that's actually really easy. You know the answer to that is just 6. So that's our answer, and we're done. So let's look at one that's a little more tricky now. So let's say I have 0.035 divide 0.5, a decimal divided by a decimal. So I'm going to start by writing it as a fraction. 0.035 divided by 0.5. So now what I want to do, see how this number now has 3 numbers after the decimal point. I want to make this a whole number. So what I will need to do is move the decimal point 3 spots to the right. If I move the decimal point here, this becomes a whole number 35. So to do that, to move the decimal point 3 spots to the right, I need to times by 1,000. So I'm going to times by 1,000 here. And if I times the top by 1,000, I need to times the bottom by 1,000. So what I get, 0.035 times 1,000 ends up as 35. I move the decimal point 1 to 3 spots to the right. 0.5 times 1,000. I need to move the decimal point 3 spots to the right. So after I move the decimal point here 1 spot, I've run out of numbers, so I write some zeros. So if I move it 1 spot, I get 5. 2 spots, I get 50. 3 spots, I get 500. So now I'm left with 35 over 500. So I simplify that. 35 divided by 5 is 7. 500 divided by 5 is 100. These two numbers here have a common factor of 5. And 7 over 100, 7 hundredths is just 0.07. See, nothing in the tenths column and 7 in the hundredths column. All right, I know that I went through a lot in this video and it is a bit tricky, so make sure you ask for help if you need. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. This has been the luckiest maths teacher in the world. Have a great day.